afternoon. My name is Jim Hoagland, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session. I'm trying to introduce Jean-Yves Le Gall, who is the president of the Centre National des Études Spatiales and also the president of the European Space Agency. He is what Vice President Michael Pence hopes to become in championing a new space force for the United States, and I think we'll have a chance to hear a little bit about your views, Jean-Yves, on that. But we're going to begin actually with a very short but very effective film, which we should start right now. Jean-Yves, that was a very fascinating short film. I particularly liked the way in which it was emphasized the role that the satellite systems today play in data transmission and accumulation. Many people are talking about data as the new petroleum of the world economy. Perhaps that's a subject we can come back to in the course of our remarks. But I wanted to ask you to begin, since you were here last year, you were at IFRI's World Policy Conference last year. Take us through the past year in terms of cooperation and competition in the space area by the international community? In which direction are we moving? And can you also then go back a decade and tell us what have been the major changes in space?
In fact, since last year, we had a number of changes because of what is made in the US. Because in space, you have six large space powers, the US, China, Europe, Japan, Russia, and India. But the US are definitely the biggest space power. And last year, a new administrator has been appointed at NASA, Jim Bridenstine, and the Trump administration tried to change a number of points in the US space policy. And I would like to insist on 2 points, which are, in my opinion, quite important. The first one, a new interest to go to the moon. But to go to the moon, not to come back to the moon, because you probably saw the many movies existing on the moon, which with the moon landing 50 years ago. The last one is First Man. It's a very good movie. But the idea is to come back to the moon, but with private initiative. And this is why NASA is now contemplating what is so-called the Deep Space Gateway with private companies which could be interested in coming back to the moon. So this is the first point, moon. And the second point, you know that in the US today there are 6 forces in the Army, which are the US Air Force, the US Navy, US Army, the Coast Guards, and the Marines, and so 5 today. And so President Trump wants to add a 6th one. It's a view because, in fact, the US are very active in the field of defense systems which are developed for space. We have a budget for NASA which is $20 billion, a budget for the DoD which is roughly the same, $20 billion. But there is obviously a political will of President Trump to create a 6th force, and we will see if he does it. And these 2 very, let us say, important factors which are today shaping the new landscape of space policy worldwide.
And do they affect the ability to cooperate by the international community?
For the moon, it is clear that we will have probably the follow-up of the International Space Station, but on the International Space Station today we have the US, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada, and 2 space powers are not in the station, India and China. And the big question mark is, are we going to see China and India being a part of the back to the moon? It's an open question. There are pros, there are cons. It is clear that it's a project which will be very, very expensive. China this year will be probably the space power with the biggest number of launches, more than 30 this year. And so there is a question mark, but in the same time, you know better than me the relationship between the US and China, which is not so easy. But this is an open question for international cooperation, and it is clear that if we have now a 6th force for defense, it will open also a number of new issues, and probably it will reinforce the will of other space powers to have also a military space program.
Tell us a little bit about Russia's space program these days. How important is it?
Russian space program is quite important. They have a fantastic heritage, but as a matter of fact, they are suffering technical difficulties. You probably saw what happened 2 weeks ago when a Russian cosmonaut and a US astronaut tried to go to the space station, and after 90 seconds in the flight, they were obliged to eject, to jettison the Soyuz capsule and to come back with a parachute because there was a malfunction in the Soyuz launch vehicle, and there are a number of quality issues in Russia.
Could you talk now a little bit about this incredible amount of data that is assembled by the space satellite system? Who owns this data? What happens to it? And how important is it to the world economy today?
In fact, the question of data is absolutely crucial because we have more and more satellites sending more and more data. And so they transmit data for telecommunications, but this point is not really an issue. What is an issue is what to do with the data related to Earth observation, and in particular data related to observing climate change. And there are two options which are on the table. There are some countries which say that this data must be proprietary and stay in the country which owns the satellite, and some other countries, and this is the case of France and Europe, which have an open data policy. And I think, personally, I think that it is the right option, because with all these satellites, we have today 2 points which are at stake. The first one, to have a kind of standardization of data, because when you observe the Earth, if you don't observe exactly the same data, you will have a dispute between China and the US, when the US will say to China, you pollute a lot, we have a lot of greenhouse effect gases, and China will not accept. And so we need to standardize the data, and this is what we are doing now. And after that, this data must be in open policy, and in my opinion it's quite important because it has a very strong political effect, and it creates also a number of startups which will use this data, which will develop new models, and I am sure that the future of space is probably relying upon an open data policy.
And when you say that we're moving to standardized data right now, explain to us what that means. What is standardizing?
For instance, if you observe the concentrations in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, there are many possibilities to observe these concentrations from space. You could measure the height of a kind of virtual column with carbon dioxide, you can describe clouds and so on. But if you don't observe exactly the same data, you will have a lot of debates between scientists. And this is why we are now preparing, and I hope we will able to sign this chart during the next One Planet Summit organized by President Macron. The first one happened in December 2017 in Paris, the second one last September in New York City, and the next one is planned for Nairobi next March. And I hope that in Nairobi we'll be able to sign a charter defining exactly which data should be observed in order to have this open data policy.
And can you explain a little bit more about this forum where this will be discussed? Does it have any private sector companies that are members, or have a way to put input into?
Yes, of course. We have a system with satellites which are owned by the governments, but after that the use of data is made by private companies, and these private companies use this data, which are free, and with this data they will create value, because in fact we have to consider this data as a kind of infrastructure which is provided by the government.
Since we're sitting here on the shoulder of Africa, tell us a little bit about Africa's role in space.
Africa now is opening the space chapter, because until 10 years ago there was a very small number of space powers. For a very simple reason, owning a satellite was immediately several $100 million. And now, because of the digitalization, because of the miniaturization, the cost of the satellites is decreasing very, very strongly, and you have more and more countries which have a space program. 10 years ago, we had 6 big space agencies. Today, we have 60, 10 times more. And so in Africa was out of space till a few years ago, and now you have a space program in Algeria, in Kenya, in Egypt, and probably the most important, this is here in Morocco, because Morocco decided to buy 2 very smart Earth observation satellites to help to manage the development of Morocco. We launched the first one last year from French Guiana, and the first one is so-called Mohamed 6A, and the next one, Mohamed 6B, will be launched on 20th of November from French Guiana as well. But there are very, very smart satellites which are manufactured in France. And this is what we used to call the African chapter, because now Africa is using more and more data for its development.
The United States, in announcing the Space Command, emphasized, or Vice President Pence certainly emphasized, his desire to maintain the superiority in the military realm in space that the United States has today, he says, on Earth. Is that a realistic objective? Is it an objective that we should wish happens?
I think that it is a realistic objective. I am not sure that it will be at the end what is described today, but we had this situation 30 years ago when President Reagan decided to develop Star Wars, and there were a number of projects which finally didn't exist, but the consequence has been that the federal budget injected a lot of money in the US space industry, and it strengthened considerably the US space industry. And I think that nobody knows what will be, at the end of the day, the consequence of the decision of President Trump, but everybody knows that it will reinforce considerably the US space industry.
For my last question, before I throw you to the audience and appeal to their mercy, talk a little bit about commercial travel in space, how Elon Musk is doing, how Jeff Bezos is doing. What are the patterns developing in commercial space travel?
To be very honest, I have a lot of doubts for the next 10 or 20 years about space travel, because we cannot be, all of us here, we cannot be astronauts. When you go into space, after 8 minutes of very strong gravity, you are in zero gravity, and most of people are immediately sick, and it's very, very difficult. And there are some projects, for instance, from Elon Musk with the big Falcon rocket, when they said that they could go from Paris to New York in 30 minutes. Okay, it can be done, but it will not be at all as in the jetliner, because it will be 30 minutes in zero gravity, so it means that after a few minutes, most of the people will be sick. And so I think that it will not happen in the coming years. After that, perhaps that after 20 or 30 years, we will find specific devices to create artificial gravity or something like that, but in a nutshell, in my opinion, it is not for tomorrow.
And should Europe aspire to a role in commercial travel in space?
We have a number of projects in Europe, but frankly speaking, there are a lot of projects in the US, in other countries, but today these are only futuristic projects, and I do not see space travel for the next 10 or 20 years. And
what about travel on Earth that we talked about last year some in our panel on the interconnected nature of the internet, and there was discussion of the ability of people in Sao Paulo to telephone for a not necessarily a spacecraft, but a high altitude vehicle. How is that developing? In fact, we have also a number of projects which exist, but during the last year we had a kind of strengthening of some projects. We spoke last year about Galileo. Galileo last year had 50 million users. Now we are at more than 500 million. And for a very simple reason is that the ships which are on the smartphone are now equipped with Galileo worldwide, and so it means that every time someone buys a smartphone is a new user of Galileo, because Galileo is 10 times more accurate than the GPS, and your smartphone chooses by itself the best accuracy. And so
1 or 2 years ago, everyone was connected to the GPS, and in 3 years from now, everyone will be connected to Galileo, and it will be the reality of what I said last year, because when we started to speak about Galileo, a lot of people told me that Galileo is the European GPS, and I answered that in 3 years, we will say that GPS is the US Galileo, and I am sure that it will be the case.
Very good. Now I'll take some questions from the audience if I could see you. I see somebody here holding up his hand. If we could have a mic down here. Please identify yourself and keep questions succinct if possible. Is there a mic? I'm not sure if this one works, but you're welcome to it. Non, c'est notre faute. C'est pour monsieur. Yes. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Leïchoubi, donc académicien, ancien ministre algérien. Le spatial, vous l'avez laissé entendre, est un marqueur de puissance. Alors, comment, selon vous, appréhendez-vous l'émergence des nouveaux pays en termes de concurrence et de bouleversement des hiérarchies, notamment la Chine, l'Inde, etc. Ma deuxième question, le spatial, outre ses capacités militaires, c'est aussi un support de l'intelligence et donc transmission des données, télécommunications, etc., pose pour un certain nombre de pays la question de la souveraineté et de l'autonomie de développement. Et sous le même angle et dans la même préoccupation, pose pour les citoyens les grandes questions d'éthique et de préservation des éléments personnels. À telle enseigne que nous avons vu des grandes puissances s'accuser mutuellement d'interférence à travers le numérique pour influencer. Et j'aimerais là avoir votre position sur cette deuxième question d'éthique.
Good question.
Ok, je vais vous répondre en français si vous voulez. La première question, donc je vous ai dit qu'il y avait 6 grandes puissances spatiales. Aujourd'hui, moi je considère que les États-Unis sont numéro 1. En numéro 2, on a ex aequo la Chine pour des raisons quantitatives, 30 ou 35 lancements dans l'année. L'Europe pour des raisons qualitatives. Nous avons des satellites à la pointe de ce qui se fait. On a lancé il y a quelques jours Bepi Colombo qui est parti pour un voyage de 7 ans vers la planète Mercure, et c'est une sonde à 2 milliards d'euros qui est à l'extrême limite de ce qu'on sait faire en matière technologique. Donc États-Unis, Chine et Europe, et puis Russie, Japon, Inde. Et nous avons maintenant beaucoup de nouvelles puissances spatiales. L'Algérie en étude, vous le savez, avec les satellites ALAT et quelques autres, parce que le ticket d'accès à l'espace a diminué. Et donc on peut avoir de plus en plus de pays qui font du spatial. Et ça, je pense que c'est très bien, parce que ça conduit à diffuser les usages de l'espace pour l'aménagement du territoire, pour l'agriculture et pour tout ce qu'on peut imaginer. Donc c'est la première question. Je vois avec beaucoup de sympathie de plus en plus de pays faire du spatial. La deuxième question sur les enjeux de souveraineté, je dirais que le spatial, il faut légiférer là aussi comme dans les autres domaines. Et les autres domaines, vous avez parlé des GAFA, de l'Internet, des choses comme ça, mais sur le spatial, on a à peu près les mêmes problématiques. Donc il y a un bureau des Nations Unies à Vienne qui travaille sur ces sujets. Il faut faire attention, parce que c'est vrai qu'avec un satellite d'observation, vous pouvez aller observer ce qui se passe chez le voisin, ça doit être encadré. Vous pouvez écouter ce qui se passe, là aussi ça doit être encadré. Alors bien sûr, il y a des systèmes militaires, il y a des systèmes civils, mais il peut y avoir aussi des entités privées qui font ce que jusqu'alors était réservé à des entités gouvernementales. Donc on légifère, on fait attention. C'est un système qui se développe, comme tous les systèmes qui se développent. Il y aura un pas en avant, parfois un pas en arrière, mais je pense que globalement, ça fait partie du développement du progrès technologique.
We have a question in the front row here, if we could have a mic there. Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Fujisaki from Japan. have a question. I think the mainstream of thinking now on space exploration is first go to Gateway that Trump administration is proposing, and then to Moon again, and then to Mars. That is the sort of mainstream way. I would like to know if there's any relations, do you think, between this low orbit gateway around Moon and landing on Moon, meaning how much you contribute to Gateway, would that be related to the possibility of going to Moon as well? If you are not trying to send European astronaut by yourselves, and still you'll be using American apparatus or Russian rocket, do you think that in order to participate in Gateway will secure your possibility of trying to have your astronauts on the rocket? Am I clear?
Yes, I think that all what is related to human flights should be made in cooperation, because the price is very, very high. If you speak about the International Space Station, which is the biggest cooperative technology project today worldwide, it's more than $100 billion which are in orbit. And it is why the Gateway now, it is considered that it should be developed in cooperation with the historic partners of the space station, US, Russia, Europe, Canada, Japan, and with perhaps some other ones, I say. But the idea is to have a kind of mid-sized space station in orbit of the Earth and on the Moon, and a low Earth orbit, but going to the Moon, with perhaps a private initiative going from the space station to the Moon, because the government wants to keep a part of the money available to go in the future to Mars, first with robots, and in perhaps 20 or 25 years with astronauts. But this is the policy today which is implemented, but as I said in my introduction, it is something which is new, because it followed the appointment of the new administrator of NASA, and the US are shaping now the post-International Space Station world policy, and we will see the future. But about the question, should we have an autonomous capacity either in Japan or in Europe to send astronauts? In fact, we are in a cooperative project, and it has been decided that the transportation should be for the Russians or the US, and we provide laboratories as you do with VHTV, as we did in the past with VITV. So it's a joint project.
We have time for one last brief question over here.
Thank you very much. Peter Jankovic, a former member of the Austrian government. Jean-Yves, there are so many fantastic developments in space, which we have seen now in this CNES movie. But there are, of course, also many dangers threatening for further developments in space. And two of those are one, space debris, the increasing number of objects floating in space and threatening space objects like the International Space Station. And the second one is the question, how are we going to regulate space traffic? Are there any plans for space traffic management? And what authorities do you see who could address these problems?
I think that it is an excellent question, and as you know, Peter, a lot of people are working today on this issue, because in fact there are 2 points. The first one, the debris. And in the past, when satellites were launched, nobody took care about the debris until a few years ago when people realized that even a very, very small debris at 8 kilometers per second, it can make a lot of damages on satellites. And so now there is a regulation. It means that in the past, when you had to separate a satellite from a launcher, you had a kind of explosive device which created a cloud of debris, and now you have just a system with no debris. So this point is the first point. We don't create any more debris, and so I think that this point is behind us. But another one which is much more interesting is that there are more and more projects using in particular constellations of satellites, and it is clear that if you launch a constellation of 4,000 satellites to put internet everywhere on the Earth, this is a project by SpaceX or Google, managing these 4,000 satellites will be quite difficult, and there are now some regulations which are implemented to avoid collisions between satellites, but we are going to have the same regulation as we have for airliners. We are just at the beginning of the satellites. We were at the beginning of airliners, let us say, in the year something as 100 years ago. And so now, if the number of satellites is going to increase, we are going to have, as you say, the space traffic management, because managing 4,000 satellites or perhaps 10,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, it is not so easy. And so it means that satellites will have some rules to comply with and to be sure that they will not collide, and so that it will be done in perfect harmony.
Just before we adjourn for lunch, I ask you to join me in thanking Jean-Yves for this rather uplifting